All right, ladies and gentlemen, walking through the door is Quorum 1 and Quorum 2, and we're so grateful. So we'll call this meeting of the full Committee of Ways and Means to order. And I know everybody's at about 6 other major committee meetings, so I'm very grateful for all the attendees here. Do we have anyone in the audience with legislation before this committee that has a particular need to go instantly? Do you, at this point? You're going to present for... all right, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Bibb County to present Senate Bill 159. Please, sir. At your seat. What are you, 10? What? 11. You're on.
This bill, Senate Bill 159, is introduced. What it does, it basically it changes the filing deadline for homestead exemptions from March 1st to match whatever the filing deadline is for property tax returns. It eliminates taxpayer confusion by having a single consolidated deadline for filing both the homestead exemption and the property tax return. And this basically gives for almost all Georgians an extra month to file the homestead exemption, which is of significant savings to a homeowner on their property tax bill. Gives them an extra month, makes it consistent with the same date that's needed for the property tax return. And I'd be more glad to answer any questions.
Pretty logical. That there is one question in 23. Is that the gentleman from Savannah area?
Representative Peake, you can still file year-round, correct? It just moves it back for the deadline?
That's correct, yes, sir. You can, and for the prior year, it moves it back 30 days. That's
Okay.
Yes, sir. You can file. Basically, this would give you 15 months to file for a particular year. Yes, sir.
Chairman Williams.
Representative Peake, the date of close, if counties have different closing, this just tracks whatever closing date they have now, so it could be.
That's correct, for the property tax return.
Right.
Yes, sir. It makes it consistent with the
county
tax return date.
Okay.
Yes, sir. That's correct. Thank you.
Seeing no further questions, any member of the committee wish to be heard on this matter? Is there anybody in the audience that wishes to be heard on Senate Bill 159, sponsored by Senator Staten? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee? I have a motion to pass by Chairman Stevens, a second by Chairman Williams. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries unanimously. We'll report this to Rules.
Thank you, Mr.
Who
Chairman.
would tell the Senator that, and I know you have other obligations.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
We're extremely honored today, and I mean that sincerely, to have with us the Chairman of Senate Appropriations, Chairman Hill. Sir, you're recognized to tell us about Senate Bill 185, please, sir. Wherever is your pleasure. Either one. Sitting down might be a little easier. I know you've had a long day like us. So, okay.
Chairman, it's been a year since I read this bill, so I'm looking at it right along with you. But
Okay.
Senate Bill 185 was actually kind of discussed and promoted with the concurrence of Representative Hurd over there, too, who's very familiar with the boat business. It comes from a constituent issue down on the coast and probably applies to every part of the state that has boat dealers who compete with other states who, and as you know, boats, and I don't know where the titling bill is now, but because boats are not titled, the recovery of sales tax is not possible when you purchase it in another state. Dealers, of course, puts them at a disadvantage, at least 7% disadvantage for those who go across state lines and purchase boats. So this was a beginning of an attempt to at least to start recognizing that there's a need to try to collect that sales tax. And this method would be to ask the Department of Natural Resources to help us in that endeavor by requiring proof of the payment of sales tax before they issued a boat permit. I started at 16 feet just to, in my original bill, just to start with sizes that are larger and more expensive and to maybe keep down the aggravation factor from small boats. But I think maybe in a substitute you folks maybe came up with last year, you removed that 16 feet. I'm not wedded to that at all, but that's basically what it is. We changed it in committee a little bit over in the Senate to be sure that folks who live on a lake in another state, that we took care of them not getting caught up in a crossfire on the purchase of boats. I think we resolved it. had the Honorable John Bullock and Senator Toss and people like that who know a lot about that kind of thing on state lines to work on it. So I think that part of it's resolved. But other than that, that's pretty much what it does.
Senator, thank you for that explanation. Would you yield to a question or two?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
Chair recognizes number 17. Is that
Are
Representative
you
Roberts?
client 17 or not?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just for clarification. So, in other words, under this bill, if you go and purchase a John boat, if you don't keep that bill of sales, then how are we going to be able to get that decal? I mean,
Well, it'd have to be 16 feet under this bill. I don't know whether you're looking at. I'm looking at the original bill that's passed the Senate. Now, I understood from the chairman we were reverting to that. Now, you may be reverting to committee sub from last year. In that case, I think.
Chairman Hill, I may have misstated you unintentionally. The limitation is the provisions of this subsection shall apply to any vessel requiring a Department of Natural Resources decal. But we are open, if at your suggestion, it's your legislation, and certainly we yield to your wisdom as to what size vessel or however else.
You know, I guess I'm always trying to keep the aggravation factor down with people, and the guy you hate is the guy that just bought a little small boat and he runs in there and says, "Yeah, I found out you're the man making me to report all this, and I bought it in South Carolina when I was on vacation or something." But I don't know how you do it if the guy doesn't keep a receipt. But that's why a more expensive boat makes a lot of difference, because you're sure going to have a receipt for that. But that's up to y'all. What do you think,
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir. May continue.
Yeah.
I guess a question back to you, the chair. Do you remember why we took the 16 foot out?
I think I don't remember who proposed that amendment. It was not me, but the goal was twofold. Obviously, to assist our governmental agencies in collecting lawfully owed taxes, both at the local level and the state level. But as importantly, if not more so, was to level the playing field for Georgia businesses that were in the businesses of marketing boats. And it's actually a use tax issue if a boat is bought out of the state and brought into the state. The tax that applies in the state of Georgia is known as a use tax. So I don't recall what the provocation of the amendment was. I would yield to the wisdom of Chairman Hill. Be glad to put it back in its original form and let the committee look at it that way as well. What are your thoughts on that, Representative Roberts?
Well, I've got concerns about an individual that goes across and buys a John boat, comes back across, and unless they're going to use it in public waterways, then they don't have to have it registered with DNR. And they decide, the first year or two they're not, and then decide to go to a public waterway and have to get it at that point, go to DNR and get it registered, and may not still have the bill of sales. And then at that point, what are we going to do as far as being able to get them that permit or that registration on the boat? So I don't know why we took out the 16 foot, but I would think that was in there to kind of help prevent.
Well, if you don't mind, if you could get the language from Chairman Hill, and we'd be glad to look at that as a potential amendment to what we have in front, which is LC 186485S.
Chairman Hill, are you?
He's got. I don't have a copy of that original language. I don't think available. So if you would craft something, we'd be glad to entertain that. 22 is that Chairman Williams?
Sir, Mr. Chairman, in Section 2, the Act becomes effective July 1, 08. Anything prior to that time would not be applied, but if folks were put on notice as of then, they had to have a bill of sale or whatever, would that not?
I'll tell you the truth, I'd give them another year. This bill was originally introduced last year, did not go into effect for a year, so frankly, I'd be friendly to an amendment to give them another year so that you go through the whole year.
That'd give them plenty.
It gives DNR a chance to get set up, and of course,
they're
actually in the process of trying to get a new boat registration system. I don't know.
Well, and we all think that may happen, but this is sort of an insurance policy to the titling bill, and obviously it's something that I think is a great idea, and we want to make sure we keep several options available to this General Assembly.
I would, I would just say in this day of credit cards and all, not many folks pay cash anymore for a new boat.
That's true.
And I guess if it ever been the way I understand it, if it's ever been previously registered, then it's not required.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
motion's in order. I'd like to propose an amendment to change it to July 09.
Well, I recognize you for a due pass motion first. If we get a second, then we'll entertain amendments. Are there any further questions, comments by members of the committee? Seeing none, what's the pleasure of the committee?
Move it, do pass.
I have a motion due pass. I have a second. Now, is there any further discussion or amendments to the legislation? Chair recognizes Representative Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to make a motion that under the substitute to SB 185, we strike the last sentence in Section 1, beginning with D and ending with decal, and insert the sentence, the provisions of this subsection shall apply only to vessels not previously registered in this state or another state that are 16 feet or more in length.
All right. I don't take shorthand. The provisions of this subsection shall apply
Only
to vessels
not previously registered in this state.
not. Why don't we say not registered prior to the effective date hereof?
That'll be fine, Mr. Chairman.
Prior to the effective date hereof.
Or another state that are 16 feet or more in length.
Mr. Chairman, if I could interject something here, and Representative Hurd, who knows whereof he speaks, says that the footage would exempt all personal watercraft. Now, whether that's something you want to put in as part of that sentence or not, that's up to you. I didn't really envision those in my original bill, but that's just for your perusal.
The footage would exempt.
Well, a personal watercraft, which can run a lot of money, I guess. I never bought one, but I understand it can. Would not 16 feet would, since it's less than 16 feet long, that would not be covered by this legislation. Now, if you want to cover those types of watercraft, then you'd need to say that. I think words to those effect. I don't know. You may have some language or something, but I'm satisfied with the bill like it is. Maybe we need separate language on something like that, a separate bill.
Well, I think the problem when we use the size is a John boat's about the same size as these jet skis, but these jet skis sell for $12,000-$13,000 sometimes, and the ogre under the bridge here is obviously a level playing field for our businesses. Maybe the amendments, the way we had it crafted with requiring a natural resources decal makes more sense. But would you like to be heard on this, Representative Hurd?
What I might suggest is personal watercraft are always fiberglass. John boats are always metal.
Not necessarily. Not necessarily.
I guess my question is, other than the nuisance factor, I guess, is there any reason to exempt a particular population? I mean, what's the equality in that? I mean, if we're going to promulgate good tax policy here, it's good for everybody. I mean, not just if you got metal or fiberglass or.
I'm just concerned, as I stated earlier, Mr. Chairman, about that being a situation, but I can withdraw my amendment.
I would like to hear from Chairman Hill on that. If you don't,
I'm fine with it. Anyway, the committee wants to send it out. It's fine with me.
okay.
I just was explaining why I originally had 16 feet, and that was
Right. Okay. And I think we're right. I think we might be exempting a fairly large price item by doing that. And
Mr. Chairman,
okay.
that being the case, I'll go back to my 2001 effective date.
2009. Okay. So you're proposing on line 21, section 2, July 1st, 2009.
Yes, sir.
Any objection to that amendment? Hearing none, that one's in. Any other amendments? Any further discussion on the bill? I don't see any. What's the pleasure of the committee? All in favor of the proposition do pass, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Passes unanimously. The rules. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you,
Hill.
members of the committee, Mr. Chairman.
We have Senator Mullis and Senator Rogers. I'll say it again now that you all have arrived. Are there any other senators I don't see? Is there anybody with an urgent need to go next? Senator Rogers?
I don't have a friend. Absolutely. We have rules in 20 minutes. We got a couple of tacticals we'd like to move forward.
Chair recognizes the distinguished chairman of Senate Finance to tell us about Senate Resolution 20. Please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the number on this bill or this resolution indicates, this is a time I've been waiting for quite some time. I do not have a copy, which I'll.
Yeah.
For many of us that entered into this thing we call the General Assembly a number of years ago, we all came in with one thing we'd like to get done. And if I go back to my days when I was with you gentlemen and ladies in the House, this is one of the first bills I ever introduced, was an idea that when the government takes more money than is necessary to run the functions of what we're supposed to do and those things that we do even though maybe we're not supposed to do, when there's money left over, that it probably ought to go back to the taxpayers in some form. Well, that's not exactly what you have here in front of you today, but it's about as close as I can get and hope for passage. This is a very simple constitutional amendment, and it would simply say that if we have a budget surplus, which we routinely do, that the surplus money would first need to go to the increased student enrollment, which we usually fund, maybe not 100%, but we usually fund. And then if there were any additional revenue beyond that, it would go into the reserve fund until that reserve fund met 8%. And if there were any additional revenue beyond that, then it would go to either relief debt so that our children and grandchildren don't have to pay for our excessive spending, or it would go back to the people who overpaid for their government. So, Mr. Chairman, that's really about all there is to the resolution. There is an escape clause, and that is if we believe there is an expenditure that we really need to have of that surplus money, and it's not one of these other items that I've already outlined here, then by a 3/5 vote, we can vote to go beyond the limit. And so this is really what I would consider very good budgeting. It makes sure that in those years when the revenue spikes that we're not spending on frivolous items that we have to then fund year after year after year, and that we take some of that extra money and we put it aside into the reserve fund until that reserve fund's at least at 8%, which is pretty close to where we are now, which is, we're very glad for that. We have a healthy reserve fund. But if the reserves fund is full and we've spent all the money we needed to spend in the big budget and we've taken care of the student enrollment increases, then we have a choice. That excess money after all that is either going to pay down debt or it's going to go back to the people who paid too much. So, and then if we come up with something special we have to spend it on by a 3/5 vote, we can even go beyond that. So, Mr. Chairman, it's a very simple resolution. The theory has been tried and used in many places, and it has worked. This is not in any way, shape, or form like Colorado. So if anyone wants to speak to that, I'll be happy to stay here all day and explain why this is not like Colorado. And not that theirs was a failure, but I would be happy to express the differences between the two.
Would the chairman be amenable to you for questions?
Yes, sir.
Members?
As many as you'd like.
The chair recognizes Chairman Williams.
Senator Rogers, thank you for the bill. In subparagraph 1 about the increases due to student enrollment, the fact that you've got that increase, are we going to specify where that money should be spent? Just the fact that we've got more children, should we specify how that money should? I mean, it's just not for frivolous items. Should we define how we spend that money we send back to school systems? And
well, this is the general practice that we have now, making sure we take care of the increase in student enrollment. So that's what we were looking at with line 15.
Okay.
And as I understand it, it's certainly numbered number 1 as the first priority as well. So
before this session began, I had the opportunity with Representative Graves, who has worked with me on this for many years, to sit down with education associations, including the GAE. And the last time I spoke to them, they were not opposed to this bill, and I have not heard that they have become opposed to it. So I'll have to I think they appreciate the fact that if we're going to prioritize this excess surplus spending, that it goes to education first.
Chair recognizes Chairman Parsons.
Thank you, Chairman. To the Senator, I know that you've been working on this for a while, and I recall it now, but I'd forgotten about it. But I don't know what the state constitution refers to this amended process as. I don't know if it refers to the Supplementary Appropriations Act. Maybe it does, but in fact, we're really just amending. We're just going through an amendment process. It seems to me like this bill is calling it. I mean, maybe that is what the official name of it is, but it seems like it's taking it at a higher level than what it really is. We're really amending the Appropriations Act that we have in place for that particular fiscal year, and I guess I'm just a little bit taken aback that we would limit ourselves to these measures in amending an Appropriations Act in the mid-year when we don't know in the future what the revenues would be or what the needs would be there at the mid-year. I mean, can you comment on that at all?
This would only on line 12. It only speaks of the revenues in excess of the revenues that were appropriated in the big budget. So this would only be dealing with surplus revenues. It would certainly not in any way restrict us from reducing something because the revenue estimate had been changed. It really only deals with what do you do with the surplus that is created.
But if I may, I mean, for example, today we passed out in the House the Senate resolution, which will be a constitutional amendment to possibly raise tax for additional transportation needs. And those needs are always there. So, and generally, since I've been here, I mean, fortunately, since I've been here, generally we have been dealing with a surplus at the mid-year. I mean, that hasn't always been the case, but generally we have. And, I mean, we have those needs in transportation and health and all those things beyond education. I guess I'm just a little concerned that we would really limit our ability to address different issues in that amended process.
I would say two things. Number one, those could all be addressed in the big budget, as they probably ought to be addressed. And number two, there's a 3/5 vote if it's an important enough issue, and you can convince your colleagues that the money needs to be spent. You can exceed the limit that is placed here. And again, this does not place any limit on spending in the big budget, which I think is important. But one thing we don't want to get into is this game of creating a surplus and then using that surplus for all sorts of things. I mean, yes, we can talk about the needs that the state has that sometimes we may need to fill at certain times, but I would argue that oftentimes we go way beyond needs when we have surplus revenues and we end up paying for it at a later date.
If I may, I apologize, but I mean I guess that's my point, though. There are certain things you can't do in what we call the big budget. For example, we don't know, as we're working on this fiscal year 2009 budget right now, we don't know what exactly the situation will be as far as needs or revenue at mid-year. And I mean, I guess that's, a lot of times we say we ought to do all these things in the budget when we initially do it, but we don't know, though. I mean, that's the purpose of having, I think, a mid-year anyway, is because you don't know when you do the budget what the needs or what the revenues are going to be at the mid-year, which just so happens to be the time we come back in here.
And this would not prevent you from addressing any needs. Again, if you'll look on line 26, by a 3/5 vote, you can surpass this cap. And I would suggest that if it's a need, you're going to get 3/5 vote. If it's a want, you may not get 3/5 vote, and that ought to be the way it is.
Chair recognizes Chairman Royal.
Mr. Chairman, I just would like to be recognized at the proper time and make a motion.
Okay, we have a few more questions, and
Okay.
I'll be glad to do that. Chair recognizes Representative Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Rogers, I sort of want to follow up on Representative Parsons' questions. I think the questions we've had before when we had a presentation similar to this in a subcommittee was, limiting spending, or are we going to restrict ourselves in any way from being able to meet the needs like you're addressing? But I think you mentioned there are no caps on the original budget, and it's simply sort of prioritizing our spending. But the interesting thing, I think, is this timeline of it all. When we deal with surpluses, it seems there's really not a lot of time left in the year. There's a couple of months. And while we still have a significant reserve, of which to draw from, I assume that's available here. This doesn't restrict any reserve spending from the supplemental process, does it? Or can you sort of address that in the timeline and how much time is left, and really, if there are needs, how would they be met other than the 2/3 or the 3/5 now?
I think you do highlight an important point, and that is that if a need is so urgent, you're going to get the 3/5 vote. And I would almost suggest that, like you said, if you've only got a couple months before you can put that into the next budget. So if it's a want, it ought to go into that next budget. But if it's a need, you're going to get the 3/5 vote. And again, I think at the end of the day, we have to remember one thing, that what we're saying here is that on Section 2 is, do the people think that we ought to spend their money in this manner? And that's ultimately what this is all about, is that, we take a lot of money from people, a lot. And I guess, I know the last few weeks we've had this discussion about tax reduction. And it does bother me a little. I was thinking about this driving to work this morning. I mean, people are hurting. I mean, they are really hurt. People are getting houses foreclosed on. And yet I look at our budget, and we're spending 3% more, 4% more. I mean, the average family, they don't get that choice. They have to go to the bank on their hands and knees and say, I can't pay my mortgage, please don't take my house. I mean, we don't print money in Georgia. We did in the 1860s. We haven't done it since that point in time. And every time we spend $1 here, that's $1 that somebody earned that can take care of their own family and their needs, and they don't have to come ask us. And maybe that's the plan, is we take all the money and force people to come ask us to help them out. Well, that's not my plan. That's not why I decided to be in the General Assembly. I decided to be in the General Assembly so that people don't have to ask the government for anything, that they can be free to spend the money they earn. And I think that when we go to the people and say, listen, when you send us too much money, more than we asked to run our government last year, what should we do with it? They ought to have the right to say there are reasonable limitations to what you do with it. And this document before you is about as reasonable as you can possibly make it. There are so many escape clauses here, but at least it puts in place some form of spending regulation for surplus revenues. And I trust the people. They ought to make the choice.
Can I follow up, Mr.
Chairman?
Chairman? Do you have any historical data on how much over the past several years there have been surpluses that we have spent when maybe they're needs or not needs? I mean, any data to sort of back that up?
Representative Graves, I don't have it in front of me, and I apologize. But it's, if you go back through the years, it's in the billions. So
there have been years that we've had significant surpluses and haven't returned it. And this would just simply put a mechanism in place in which to, I guess, prioritize education first, savings second, and then if there's still additional,
no doubt about that. And more importantly, if you go back and look at the line, here's how our budgets have gone over the last 25 years. They go like this. You put this in place, and they go like this. We all, for those of us that were here in 2003, we remember how difficult that is. If this had been in place from 1999 up until 2003, there would have been all the reserve money we needed to take care of all those problems in 2003. Those cuts we made would not have had to been made. And I would submit to you that, in some of those years before that, when the revenue was pouring in, that maybe we spent money on some projects perhaps we didn't need to, that could have gone into the reserve fund, so that when that rainy day showed up in 2003, and it may show up next year, that we had the money on hand. So I just think this is a great way to prioritize our spending of surplus money only.
We certainly have asked our local governments to join in that effort of fiscal responsibility, and this just says to them we're willing to operate under the same fairness doctrine as we're asking them to as well.
Yes, sir.
Representative Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple questions. One, on line 15, where we say increases due to student enrollment for local school systems, right now we hear all this adequately funding education, where are we going with this? I mean, how do we know? Are we going to go by QBE funding formula or what to get to that point? I mean, I like your bill, but I'm trying to see, are we leaving it broad there or?
Well, we are leaving it somewhat broad, but being, that it's the Constitution, we probably ought to leave it somewhat broad. But the intent is clearly only to do what we have been doing in funding the mid-year adjustment. That's what we're trying to do here, is make sure that we do fund the mid-year adjustment. And that is, to Representative Parsons' point, one thing we don't know is how many students are going to show up, and that's over 50% of our budget. And we need to make sure that when they do show up, we fund them, and that's what this is directed towards.
Chairman Martin. 28, I've got you. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman of Senate Finance, I want to make sure when you get over at rules, you'll get House Bill 1244 out in whatever form it may be this afternoon.
That's what we look to do.
Yes, sir. Now, on a serious note, what I think you're looking at here, and I think Representative Graves had a similar resolution over in the House, but what you're simply wanting us to do at the end of a budget year, when we create a budget and leave here, we should have put in the budget all those things that we deem necessary to operate the state. And if the revenue comes in above what is necessary to pay those, you want to go down 1, 2, 3 on lines 15 through 20 there and do those things. Is that not true? I mean,
that is exactly right.
If it had been more important than that, and it had been necessary, and we had needed more money, the governor had the option to budget money from the revenue when we were creating from the revenue reserve when we were creating the big budget, or we would have had the option as a legislator to enhance revenue if we needed to do it. But I think what you're trying to get at here is if it was important to do for like FY09, we should have done it in the FY09 budget process, and not just because we find new money when we come in January. Is that what you're trying to do?
Yes, sir. And many of us, and I hate to keep going back to the when I got here, but many of us stood out on the front steps a few years ago and signed a document for New Georgia when our governor took over, and in that document was this.
And to follow up on that, I think part of the problem being, part of the appropriation process, as are many of the members of this committee and those sitting here in the Senate, when that new money comes in, there's almost without this, if something's not deemed to do with it, somebody else is going to do with it. I mean, I'm just going to be honest and say that in front of everybody in this room. And it's not necessarily projects that aren't worthy, but it's maybe projects that could wait to the big budget. So I mean, I think if this goes into, if the voters choose to do this, and this becomes part of the Constitution, and both bodies, including the governor, both bodies of the legislature, including the governor's office, who recommends an amended budget, I think we'll all be playing with those same rules, and we'll set things forward. And I tend to agree. I guess I'm asking a question, but I tend to agree with you that if there's something that is needed, 3/5 of the legislature can vote on it on a basis. So I'm just trying to see. You don't see a downside in the fact that if something were to come up, we had terrible tornadoes here in Atlanta a month or so ago, or a few weeks ago actually. Last year we had them down in Americus. If something were to come up and need to be appropriate, that's certainly something that we could either appropriate out of reserve revenues or with monies at mid-year, right?
Well, you can certainly, I mean,
those are the things you would see that we could bring forward on their face and earn 3/5 if necessary.
Absolutely. I can't imagine anyone standing in the way of doing something like that. And the greatest pressure we have in this building ought to be the pressure to prioritize how we spend the people's money. And that pressure should be constant.
Chairman Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're all too eager to cap property tax reassessments on school boards and counties, cities, all the taxing authorities. I think this sends a good message to the voters, and I hope we move forward.
We're willing to live by the same rules we ask them to live by.
Exactly.
Okay. Recognize you for a question, Chairman Royal.
Senator Rogers, there's some concerns about the language there, but I noticed on page 2, paragraph C, should we need any clarification of any of the provisions, you do have a provision there for enabling legislation which could be adopted at a subsequent time.
Yes, sir, absolutely.
Okay. Any member of the committee wish to be heard with an eloquent soliloquy on this bill? Chair would recognize Chairman Royal for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to move due past the substitute to Senate Resolution 20.
That's LC 187529S. I have a second by Chairman Lewis. Any further discussion? Yes, sir.
In this discussion before the vote, I just would have to say, in good conscience, as a member of the Appropriations Committee for, I think, 12 of my 14 years now, and knowing the needs that we have and having gone through this amended process, and that's what it is. It's an amendment process. It's not really a supplemental. Here again, I don't know what it's called in the state constitution, but it's not really a supplemental budget. It's an amendment process to the budget that we're currently in at that time. I just, in good conscience, could not vote for this, and that's my part of the discussion, sir.
The gentleman certainly has that right. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign.
No.
Okay, the ayes clearly have it. Senator Rogers will have this in Rules
Mr. Chairman, members, thank you very much for your time.
Okay, gosh, what an honor. We have with us today the distinguished Chairman of Transportation. Could I ask you to wait one more bill? I had not had the opportunity to ask you if you were hurt, but I've got one other urgent request for a short.
Please take care of these households.
That's actually a senator we're going to take care of. The chair recognizes Chairman Lewis for Senate Bill 58. Please, Chairman Lewis, from your seat.
Number 20. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a bill that repeals an old, what I understand, an old and archaic law. And what this does, if we take this action, it would allow taxes that are assessed and billed in two different counties to be paid in only one county, with the receiving county being required to transmit payment to the other county, their appropriate share or portion. And my understanding, Mr. Chairman, that's simply all it does, and I ask for favorable consideration.
Are there any questions of the presenter, this legislation? I don't see any. What's the pleasure of the committee?
Second.
I have a motion due pass and a second. Any further discussion on Senate Bill 58? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Motion carries unanimously. Would you alert Senator Smith that his bill's in rules? Thank you. Now, with no further ado, what a pleasure it is to have with us, and I mean that sincerely, one of the finest elected officials that's ever been in the Capitol, the Chairman of Transportation in the Senate, my friend and a great friend of Georgia, Senator Jeff Mullis, to present Senate Bill 271.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me suggest that it's truly my pleasure to be in front of such an incredible committee with such powerful members, and to see the process in this committee has been really inspirational to me today. And I want to thank you for allowing me to have a few more moments to share that and see that. Well, anyway, Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing me to present Senate Bill 271, which actually comes to me from people back from Representative Scott's in my district. But this talks about after a terrible process has happened, which is selling somebody's property on the courthouse steps, which has happened through due process, which is an extremely intense process that tries to find the property owners and have them pay for their, you have something to offer there? Okay.
That's
and have to pay, pay for their taxes, their property taxes that they have not paid for several years perhaps or whatever. And after this is sold on the courthouse steps, currently the law says that even though somebody buys property as an investment or maybe to put their own home there, they still can't improve the property for 4 years with the possibility of finding heirs or the property owners, and they decide they do intend to pay the property taxes at that time, which keeps the property from improving all those years. Well, the original bill had the reducing that time from 4 years to 2 years, and the Senator Rogers and his committee, the Wisdom, brought it down to 1 year. And I understand you have a substitute for putting it back to 2 years, and I prefer 1, but to the wisdom of the committee, 2 would be okay as well. Jean McCrae is representing an entity that prefers 2, and she's a dear friend, and I have no problem with that, but I do prefer 1. I'd be glad to answer any questions if I can.
Mr. Chairman, we actually hate to disappoint you. I mean, we don't have a sub that changes it to 2.
Okay, Gene, do you not have that?
It's for one. We can keep it at one.
Okay. Well,
We do have a sub, and I'm not sure what it changes that Representative Martin Scott submitted to the committee.
Okay.
And is that what let's make sure we clarify. Are we considering that sub 187477 ERS, or are we LC 149706S?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to certainly recommend that we consider LC 187477 ERS, which is a substitute which adds Section 2, which I believe the tax commissioners were also wanting as well.
Sure.
And I'm not sure if Senator Mullis has a copy of this substitute or not, but maybe we could get a copy of that for him.
And nor do I mind having one. Representative Scott's going to handle this bill, so the wisdom of the committee is what we're needing today.
I guess what I need to know, though, from the author,
Yes,
who we respect unconditionally, is, are you presenting then the sub or your original?
Well, I was presenting the original bill that passed the Senate because that's all I have currently. But I do now have LC 187477 ERS. Which one is that?
Is that the bill which you wish this committee to consider?
I have no idea.
That's a
whatever Representative Scott has offered is definitely fine with me.
I certainly yield to the distinguished gentleman from Chickamauga. Whatever he likes there. I mean, we had discussed this, Mr. Chairman, in committee. I think that this was something that certainly Representative David Knight, and that is Section 2, which is part of 7477 ERS. Section 2 is a bill, I believe, that Representative Knight, to my right here, had introduced and had not had the opportunity to get it all the way through the system. I think that they had an agreement to allow this to be a part of this bill, and with the Senator's indulgence, I certainly think that it would be appropriate to allow it to continue on with this.
Mr. Chairman, always honored to assist my House members.
Well, without your objection, then we will be considering LC 187477 ERS,
Thank you.
which is the sub that now contains the new Section 2.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very honored. Thank you.
Okay, good. Any other questions?
That'd be the best thing to have. Just pass it.
They're fine. Everybody's fine. They want to do 2 years on here, but they know he's to this place.
Representative Scott, do you want to speak just briefly to Section 2? We are entertaining the idea that might actually violate the state constitution, but why don't you tell us what it does?
Mr. Chairman, I sure wouldn't want to do that, but it's my understanding that this is something that the tax commissioners have asked for, and here's the reason for it. There was a decision it was in 2006, City of Fort Valley v. Grills, and I'm certainly not going to speak to the legal aspects of this, but this decision made it impossible for tax commissioners to I believe, to collect fees in a pre-levy execution, as opposed to a tax sale levy in the tax sale levy. So they would have to actually take something to the execution of a tax sale in order to be able to collect fees that they had incurred, fees for expenses that they had incurred along the way for the purposes of collecting taxes. And I think that this portion of the bill, that what this does is it would state into the law that it is okay for the tax commissioners to collect those fees, those reasonable fees that they have incurred as expenses along the way in a pre-tax levy.
Okay. So it does affect either the increase or decrease, depending on circumstances subsequent, of revenue. So what I'm told by legislative counsel is the Senate bill needs to be dealt with in its original form as Chairman Mullis originally presented it, and then it can appropriately be amended by this committee. But presented directly from the Senate with revenue implications would not be what we would be able to do. So I think, members of the committee, we will go back for our consideration to Senate Bill 271 LC 149706S.
Okay.
And at the appropriate time, we may entertain an amendment, which could be the addition of that Section 2 in its entirety.
I understand, Mr. Chairman. That'd be fine.
Are there any questions of the author? Anybody have laudable statements about the author they'd like to make? I don't. 26, is that Representative Knight? Or you have a question? You wave. Recognize Representative Roberts for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion Senate Bill 271 do pass.
And I have a second by Representative Bryant. Discussion 27.
At the proper time, we'll make a motion to amend.
Amend, okay. Any amendments? The chair recognizes Chairman Knight now.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I want to make a motion that we amend Senate Bill 271 by adding in Section 2 that is found on LC 187477 ERS.
And renumber what currently is Section 2 to Section 3?
Yes, sir, and renumber accordingly.
Well, actually, you might want to add a Section 3 as well and delete Section 2 from the current bill, maybe, if you'd look at it. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but...
Yes.
Okay, I think the gentleman's motion is to add Section 2 to Senate Bill 271 and also Section 3 that is printed and on your desk as the formerly known as Senate substitute. Is everybody with the chair on what we're talking about? Has anybody got any questions of the gentleman about his amendment? Is there any objection to the amendment? There is objection. I'm not sure what you mean by building, but that might be a fairly adequate description of what we're doing. We're certainly adding it to this Senate bill, yes.
Yes, sir, that's what I was just getting at. So we're getting back to this verbiage of the ERS bill to do the amendment process.
His amendment is a proposal not to get back, but to put it in exactly as the language is here on Section 2 and Section 3. As I understand it, is that correct, Representative?
That is correct, Mr. Chairman.
All right. We have a second on the, is there any objection to the amendment? Seeing none, the amendment's in. So now, we have a motion do pass and a second now for Senate Bill 271 LC 149706S now as amended. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, like sign. Carries unanimously, as I suspected it would, and we are delighted to
Mr.
have you with
Chairman,
us.
what a way to end the day. And let me thank you for letting me end it here. And let me know if the Senate Transportation can be commendable to any of these gentlemen. And
Well, I
ladies
really would
with
like for you to go kind of back across the hall and let your colleagues in the Senate know that there are two other bills to come before this committee. Both are House members, and they have waited patiently where we could take care of all of our Senate colleagues first.
And thank you for that. I will note that, please.
I think that should be noted. Thank you. Because I certainly am going to suffer from that. Indeed, either of you two have a particular urgency. Would you like to flip a coin? I'd be glad to. I think Chairman Hurd's certainly been very patient. You're recognized, sir, to present House Resolution 1563, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you'll recall, I remember seeing a cartoon one time. I saw a little cat hanging there, and the buzzard sitting up on the hill above him saying, "Patient, tell all something." At any rate,
I'm sure that's relevant somehow.
I have the House resolution that I brought before you before that we made minor modification to, and it was the amendment that we did was on line 16, 17, and 18, where we, instead of designating
Well, I want to make sure I understand. For consideration before the committee today, though, Chairman Hurd, is LC 284250S. So that is a sub drawn by you, and that's what you're asking us to consider. Are there any questions for the chairman about House Resolution 1563 for a study committee on this very important matter? I don't see any. What's the pleasure of the committee? I have a motion from Chairman Peak to pass. Did I hear a second? Chairman Parsons? Okay. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye. Opposed, like sign, carries unanimously, and I'm sure that the Chairman of Rules will deal with this, as I'm told, on the 38th or 39th day with all of these resolutions. Thank you, sir. And again, thank you for your patience. Last but certainly never least, number one always in your heart at least, Chair recognizes the distinguished gentleman, Representative Lunsford, from the 110th, House Resolution 1625, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. House Resolution 1625 is actually a fairly simple measure. We had a bill progressing through Health and Human Services, and it was progressing a little more rapidly probably than we needed it to. Basically, we were afraid that we may make some rash decisions, so rather than pass the legislation, the committee members felt it would be good to study that issue rather than passing the legislation with it, Mr. Chairman. So we tabled the measure and drew up a resolution to study the issue over the summer to learn what would be best for the state of Georgia and the industries involved.
Could you summarize for the committee, please, sir, what we're going to study here, just in very summary form?
Discussing on the legislation was the percentage of indigent care provided by not-for-profit hospitals in relation to the tax savings they receive within the state. And we found during the study that many of the hospitals provided very little, or what we would deem to be very little, back to the state of Georgia in exchange for what we had given them. We found that some hospitals provided less than 1% indigent care, Mr. Chairman, and some of them compensated their executives at almost the same level of total compensation that they provided for indigent care for the entire year as well. And we wanted, kind of curious to see if that was fair to the taxpayers of the state of Georgia, that we had offset their personal property tax, their ad valorem tax, their sales tax, and their income tax in exchange for providing indigent care that we found some hospitals had refused to provide to a certain degree, or were providing very little Medicaid, but mostly Medicare, which pays at a higher percentage. And we just wanted to look at the issue and see if we could come up with something that was fair across the board to treat the for-profit and not-for-profit hospitals, where one was receiving a significant tax advantage and the other was not. And it appeared that some of the for-profit hospitals were actually providing more in charity care and indigent care than the not-for-profits and receiving none of the tax advantages. And so we just wanted a little time to study it with the lateness of the session without doing something right.
And it's obviously a very complex issue, and we're dealing with a federal mandate and several other circumstances. And I've seen you've already collected a good bit of data in this regard, and I look forward to that study progressing. Any other questions for the author of this legislation? I don't see any. You just wowed this committee completely. What's the pleasure of the committee? I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, like sign. It carries unanimously. Any member of the committee have any further business to bring before the... Yes, sir. Chairman Parsons.
I've never done this in all my career down here, and I may be probably am making something way bigger out of something that it should be. I don't know what is going to happen to Senate Resolution 20, but I just want to serve notice or whatever that I have to do. It's my intention to file a minority report on this.
The gentleman has that right, so acknowledged. Any further business by any member of the committee to come before the committee? Seeing none, we stand adjourned. Thank you.